Check. Yeah? Right. Check. Check. Audio. Check. check, audio, check.
Buonasera a tutti, qui al Museo Dado vediamo un po' di facce, ma sappiamo che ci seguono anche da remoto, sempre in molti. Benvenuti a questo altro appuntamento che si colloca nella serie delle conferenze organizzate dalla Stazione Zoologica e dalla Fondazione Dorni in occasione della mostra temporanea sugli squali del Mediterraneo, inaugurata ancora quest'estate. Come vedete, continuiamo a proporvi contenuti nuovi. E oggi avremo il piacere di ascoltare e ammirare il lavoro di Marc Dando, un illustratore di fama internazionale. Come si diventa un illustratore scientifico? Marc non a caso si laureò in zoologia alla Nottingham University, ma di pari passo ha sempre portato avanti la sua passione per l'illustrazione naturalistica e della fauna selvatica in generale. Iniziò a lavorare come designer e poi avvenne, come per tutti, l'occasione della vita in cui iniziò a lavorare proprio sull'illustrazione naturalistica, con testi di grande successo, iniziando da Sea Life, una guida completa agli ambienti marini, e passando poi a pubblicazioni più recenti, Squali Sharks of the World, un pocket, una versione tascabile nel 2015, per poi arrivare invece alla guida completa, estremamente dettagliata, pubblicata nel 2021. Nello stesso anno, e un po' più vicino a noi, con gli stessi autori, Marc ha pubblicato Field Guide to Sharks, Rays and Chimeras of Europe and the Mediterranean, quindi proprio i mari che ci circondano. Questo è stato un testo che noi abbiamo preso molto in considerazione nella preparazione della mostra agli squali del Mediterraneo che vi circonda, Ed è stata tale l'accuratezza, il dettaglio delle immagini di Marc e soprattutto la completezza, perché non ha saltato una specie presente nel Mediterraneo, e ci siamo avvalsi proprio della sua opera all'interno di questa mostra. Abbiamo poi potuto conoscere una persona molto disponibile che oggi è proprio qui per raccontarci che cos'è per lui l'illustrazione scientifica e che valore ha e ha avuto nella storia e nella comunicazione e divulgazione della scienza. Un'ultima parentesi, abbiamo qui in sala anche Eugenio Ricca della Ricca Editore, che ha curato per l'Italia la versione italiana di questo testo a tempo di record, e oggi in anteprima, possiamo dire anteprima non esclusiva, però in anteprima abbiamo delle copie del libro acquistabili presso il nostro bookshop. Io non rubo altro tempo a Marc. Eccola qua, la versione italiana del libro di Marc. Eccola qui, che potete trovare poi al bookshop. Non voglio togliere altro tempo, Marc parlerà in inglese, ma se dovesse essere necessario, insomma, siamo pronti a dare qualche indicazione. Come vedrete, le slide sono anche in parte in italiano per aiutare a seguire. Marc, sorry for the time I steal you. It's your turn.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm just going to run through a few bits and pieces about what scientific illustration is for me. Other scientific illustrations will have another view of it, but so I will start with probably the first questions that should always be asked, and that is, what is scientific illustration? So basically, trying to find a defined way, nice and simple wording, I came across a little bit from the Guild of Handbook of Scientific Illustration. It says that as art reflects culture, scientific illustration reflects the findings of science and technology. So basically, it is a view of science. So my interpretation would be it's easier to understand, to get across a message, because so much scientific information can be very confusing. It's long words. So in a way, my work is to try and get across that message from the scientist, from the researcher, to the person that's actually viewing it, to get them to understand it as quickly and succinctly as possible. So it's also showing things that does actually happen, but you can't actually have a photograph. We knew that these two killer whales were actually attacking white sharks, but nobody had a photo. There were blurry ones or whatever. So I did a magazine shot of this. And so you're able to actually show things that would possibly never be photographed. It's also things that are far, far away. You see a lot of these things from galaxies and for the universe, and basically it's able to point out things that you could never see. There are some amazing telescope images, but they all have to be enhanced and played around with. It's also showing simple anatomical details. This, if anyone's ever dissected a shark, is not as clean as this when you actually do this. So you've got to simplify it. You've got to make it very clear how the parts all go together. Otherwise, I've worked off photographs for these things, and it takes ages to try and get the detail in to understand how it all fits. It's also things like the prehistoric stuff. You know, we'll never see these things running around, I'm afraid. So they all have to be worked on by illustrators. I come in at a different side. I don't work with the computer CGI work, which is absolutely amazing. But again, that is all illustrators producing things that will never ever be seen. It's also it's concepts that have to be got across quite simple. This is actually showing a thing called uh, Snell's window. So it's the thing that when you're underwater, why all light seems to be condensed over your head. It's because it gets distorted. But this quite simply explains Snell's window, but it also explains that it's all on about an archerfish. Fishes have to allow for Snell's window. So when they squirt to catch a fly, they have an understanding of that fly isn't actually there where it looks like to its eyes. Again, it's anatomical. You can point out very simplistic things. I've seen cutaways of these things. This is what I worked off. But it just makes it a lot simpler for people to understand how something can actually work. In the past, these simple illustrations were used by herbalists. I'll talk about later about all these very important, really old books, because if the illustrator didn't get it right or get the understanding across, somebody's possibly going to be really ill because the herbalist has given them the wrong actual plant. So to actually give an idea of where scientific illustration comes from, I'm going to whiz back a long time ago. We've always had the ability to do scientific illustration. So the first thing to actually look at is we're going to go back to the Paleolithic time. Historically and biologically, illustrations have been in use since the beginnings of man's exploration and attempts to understand the world around him. The Paleolithic cave paintings were so detailed that we can now even recognize species and breeds of many of the depicted animals. So the first place to look at is the Chauvet Pont d'Arc cave. Sorry about my pronunciation. It's 30,000 or over 30,000 years old. But the work there, I think a lot of illustrators will be quite pleased exactly what they've ended on. It's such a simplistic lines to actually depict what those species are. And they're so good that they can even work out what the species were. You can actually go back and use them as, you know, like an archetype animal. Then further forward in time is Lascaux. Anybody visited Lascaux? Seen it? Absolutely amazing. If you think how far back they are in the cave as well, it's like, how'd they do it? I don't know. Again, you can see where some of my work can come from or inspired by. It's the simplistic lines there. It's not overdrawn, it's not over-detailed. It hasn't got all the finite hairs or whatever, but you can still see the outline of the animal with all the features there. This one is said to be the first proper anatomical illustration. It's meant to be a heart of a mammoth. And if that is actually true, that's 15 to 20,000 years ago when we're actually doing anatomical drawings. So we've been doing it for quite a few years now. Then you go to the times the Egyptians with their illustrations. Their illustrations were far more detailed. They had the colour, and you can start to see where a lot of the first roots of scientific illustration can actually be seen. And papyruses were found with a background of what the plants were, mainly to do with herbalism again, you know, what plants can be used to treat certain ailments. We move forward in time, I'm whizzing through time here, to Herophilus, a Greek, and this is a likeness of him because I think it was done from several parts, statues that were found. But what was the thing about him is that sorry, I skipped a few pages here. Was that he was one of the first people to actually sorry, I'm just whizzing through. He was the first person to actually measure the pulse, which he used a water clock. He also he wrote a book for midwives and a treatise on anatomy and the causes of sudden death. And these were the sort of basic illustrations that were used in those times. if we move further forward, Pandanius, he actually produced quite a few volumes on herbalism. There are various versions. I think there's one here. Is there a copy of the actual herbalist? This one I always like. If anyone's watched Harry Potter, you can see where the actual image came from the mandrake. Here's your probably the best illustrator that probably has ever existed. I don't think all his work has ever survived, but what there is, like the Vitrolio Man and his anatomical studies, has been the basis of everybody else's work from him. There, he is the benchmark which everybody works to. And what people don't know a lot of is his studies of flowers. But there isn't much work left over. I mean, I've got figures of about 19 sheets of these or something like that, so there's not a lot. So it's disappointing, because I'm sure with his skill, he would have had a lot more work out there that we could actually use. And again, here's the crab. He must have spent ages doing these things, and these are all in pen as well, so you've got to get it right rather than with pencil. The Vesalius, I mean, he probably produced the most amazing anatomical studies of humans at the time. The nice thing about his work, and most intriguing thing, is there you got somebody not only just doing the actual accurate illustration, but putting them in poses, trying to make a piece of art out of what he's trying to explain. So they became people, as it were, rather than just cadavers lying on a bench or whatever, and he's having to draw them. He's actually trying to make them appear alive. Etienne de Flacco, he was quite an intriguing person, but he produced a guide to Madagascar, where it was probably, some people actually say it's the first real field guide to any species. Some were not quite what you would exactly expect. I mean, a lot of these were, I mean, the fish roundabout were okay, but you can see the starts of where all our ideas of field guides, actually comparing species against other species. Then we go on to Marianne. She was a German in the 1647 to 1717. She was a naturalist and a scientific illustrator, and she first published her book on natural illustrations, titled Neues Blumenbuch, in 1675, when she was only 28. Some of her work is actually absolutely astounding. In 1699, the city of Amsterdam awarded Marianne a grant to travel to South America with her daughter, and after two years she had to come back because of malaria, and that is when she started working on all these books to do with South America and her experiences out there. Some of the most amazing butterfly illustrations. Again, these are really good because it's showing the life history of this butterfly. And that's when you're starting to get art come into illustration, into scientific illustration, to create wonderful plates that people will actually not only look at because there's scientific information there, but also it's a pretty picture. This is probably one of the most famous, more modern scientific illustrators, Audubon. He produced the most amazing plates. These plates were absolutely huge. They were 39 inches by 26 inches. And what he used to do in his studio, he used to shoot these birds especially, and he used to pose them, actually impose, and they were actually done nearly life-size, these things. And so he had all his studio was all set up with all these specimens all dotted around the place, all posed up. And these things cost an absolute fortune. So he actually got together enough money so to pay for the printing. And you're going to be shocked by this with the printing costs. The printing cost at that time was $115,000. So the cost nowadays would be $2 million for a first print run. I doubt whether any publisher would ever want to do that at all. So that's his dedication, was to raise that money to produce the most amazing plates. I'm sure many of you see these things around, all as prints, as T-shirts. The other thing that most people don't know a lot about it is he did studies on mammals, but this was at the end of his years, and in the end, his son and his son-in-law had to finish all the artwork. But again, these are huge, great plates. But the detail there, is extraordinary. And if you think a lot of these were actually actual copper etchings, so it wasn't just drawn first. It's a lot more effort. I put in Elizabeth Gold because she was hidden because of her husband, John Gould, who most people know about. But her work was extraordinary as well. But again, it seems the women, when they start to become scientific illustrations, they go out in the field and wherever they catch something. And she only lived until she was about late 20s, early 30s. But in that time that she produced most amazing artwork. And then what this museum is partly named after, Darwin himself. I think most people know about the Voyage of the Beagle, but I think most people didn't realise how much work he did himself with these illustrations and input into it and the sketches he did. I mean, again, he sent not only his thoughts about evolution, but also the standards of artwork again. And then Henrik Heikel is probably one of my most favourite scientific illustrators. Has anyone got this book? And if they haven't, you've got to get it. You've got to get it. Most amazing plates. They're not always absolutely scientifically accurate, but they are just the most amazing and gorgeous pieces of graphic art. I mean, the work that went into that is just absolutely stunning. And the mind that goes into creating things, every single piece. I mean, he's on T-shirts and everywhere else. So the first work that ever published was that there was over 100 detailed multicolour illustrations. So I think this book is still in print. That's how well it's been received, because you can say they're not scientifically inaccurate, but as pieces of artwork, they're absolutely amazing. Right, running on from that, the one thing that you might have noticed running through those ones is accuracy. Can anyone tell me what that says? What was it? Is Paris in? No, it's not Paris in the spring. Read it. Read it carefully. Sorry, I'll do it carefully. Here's the hint. Hold on. In the spring. This is what your mind can do. Your mind can make you see things that aren't actually there. And this is the one thing that all scientific illustrators have to bear in mind, is that you've got to draw what you see or paint what you see. You can't start making up what you think it should be. So when you have these early descriptions that these illustrators had to work out what they were actually seeing, is you ended up by them thinking, well, it's like a bellows or something like that, and then they start to draw things that aren't actually always on the animal. The armour plating of a rhinoceros. It's understandable how it ended up like that, but it's just, again, the mind running away with itself a little bit. There are some even scarier things of this porcupine. But the better ones were the marine animals that tended to sort of get distorted. I mean, I don't know how the walrus ended up with wings, but and a weird tail. But again, it goes back to descriptions, or even seeing part animals and trying to make sense of it, not actually drawing what they see or listening very carefully to what they should be taking the information from. And some of the fish, again, get quite bizarre, because again, it's a description or a part animal or whatever, and they're trying to make it more interesting, or they're getting confused about what they're actually looking at. And the whales, well, they always get distorted, huge, great fish. As we know, they're not, they're mammals. Slowly over the years, we started to actually improve the sperm whales. I mean, I've never seen a sperm whale with that large a eye, I'm right, but it's going in the right direction. But you can start to see, you know, that we're slowly improving through time. We're going for the accuracy of what we see, and not just making it up. This is one of the best ones at all. If you look here, it's got legs. Does anyone know what they were trying to draw? They were claspers. So they were shark claspers. And the only interpretation that they had at that time, what they could possibly be being so large, was had extra legs. So again, this was everywhere. This was printed in the papers and whatever. So that's a misconception by the artist. We did slowly improve. This is Coochie's one. But I don't know where the peppercorn snout came from. So again, it's just not quite right, slightly getting confused. But this is in the past. What happens now? The goblin shark, this is one of the first illustrations of the goblin shark. But the one thing they didn't understand for the real species is that what actually happens with the real live animal is that the jaw drops. So all these specimens that they did, because they're all dead specimens, their jaw drops and they draw it like that. And people start to look for a shark that has this weird goblin type head. That's why it's ended up with the name the goblin shark, because it looked like a goblin. So that's my latest illustration of the thing, to actually show that how, you know, it hasn't dropped down. It can drop down when it's feeding, but that's not actually how it looks. This one, Epithelurus dorsoni, this was in the first Sharks the World from the FAO guide, and then came along with the Collins version. This is what I redrew, because that's what I thought it was. What they later found out was this was actually a juvenile of a preserved specimen, and that's how it actually looks. So it's even happening now. I often go and look at all the photos that are coming through from all the research that I know, and I sometimes have to go back to my illustrations to try and improve them all the time. It's the one thing, you've got to draw what you actually see and improve it all the time. This one's a really good story. This is the big eye sand tiger, Odontaspis noronhai. This came from a paper. I'll just check which the paper is. So this one came from a paper in the Northeast Gulf Science. Why it was brought into question was because I was working on a guide with Dave Ebert for the FAO, that they wanted a simple to use guide used for the pelagic fleets in the Indian Ocean, so the observers could actually name what species that they were actually looking at. Because up until then, they didn't have anything as accurate enough, and it just went through as a shark, not actually specifying what species. So the FAO knew this was happening. They wanted to get these observers actually IDing the actual species. So when I started working on this species, I really hadn't looked closely at it, but I started looking at all the photos there, and I could see that there were two types of shark because of the shapes of the fins. There was this one, which is what we ended up by actually using, and there's this one. Now, because of this conversation started from Dave and myself, and going back to that original paper that I was looking at, there is going to be soon hopefully a paper out on this possible new species. I don't know what it's been called or anything else like that, but I do know there is going to be a paper out on it. And some people are even saying there could even be 3. The trouble with this one is the reason why it all got confused was because this is a huge 4-meter, chocolate brown, green-eyed, with a little white tip on the first dorsal. It's so obvious people go, oh, that's a big eye sand tiger. They don't look at the details because it looks so obvious. It should be that one. And again, it's that overlooking of what you're actually viewing. So I'm going to quickly go through how I do this, because everybody's asked me I've been asked why aren't I sitting there actually drawing something and painting something big. I don't work normally very large when I work. So what I do tend to do is I do loads and loads and loads of sketches. Every single time I read through books, I look at loads of photos, because every single angle, because what you're trying to create is an average of that species. It's not that particular one. Some people do specify they want that particular specimen, but it's loads and loads of sketches trying to get the pose right, trying to understand how it's put together. So I end up with a final sketch. This final sketch then goes off to the client or whoever's doing the researcher for them to approve it. If that's all approved, then there's a final pencil drawing, and then I work it up to colour. And I work on computer with these things. I'll go through the stages with that. But to getting to that point, there are so many points. I reckon I spend at least half my time doing the research and rough sketches. Again, with this Mako, with loads of sketches, these are just a few that I was able to grab hold of, because the trouble with sketches is if you keep all your sketches, you end up with so much stuff all over the place. So basically, a lot gets shredded and aren't found. So again, I end up with a final drawing, and I work it up to colour. But I thought I'd do this one to actually show how the pencil drawing's put together. This is of Robin's Chimera. Whoops. Sorry, me throwing stuff around the place. Yeah, this is of Robin's Chimera. What I tend to do, it's okay, I can think that. Yeah. So with the colour there, that's the base colour that I always do. So if I go back to that one there, so there's a pencil drawing first, which is then scanned into computer. I then put a base colour in. The base colour, I mean, is like a flat colour, as if there's no surface there at all. This is the stage that also has to be approved, and this is the stage that often gets altered. And the nice thing about the way that I can produce the stuff is that if later on there's another colour variation that is wanted, I can produce a colour then in that flat version, rather than having to go back to drawings and then start all over again. The reason why I've ended up by using this method is that literally I used to go around in circles sometimes trying to get everything right. With the client or the researcher or author or whatever, and literally I used to end up with like about 14 or 15 illustrations of the same species, and I only get paid once. So it just is not cost effective to actually do it. But it just means, like here, I've just added a few more shadows. This is not an easier one to view, and then the highlights. I also work in pen and ink. This one is stippling. If you do this much stippling, it's best to do something else at the same time. I used to be able to sort of watch television and do stippling at the same time, because literally it drives you mad. I started counting and I got to about 100,000 dots, and it just literally stopped doing. But it's a nice yeah. And if anyone wants to try and have a bit of fun, is that if you start to stipple, if you want to stipple and get your stippling right, just draw a square and try to make a even stipple across the whole surface. Don't make it lighter or darker or whatever in different areas. If you try to do dark all over or light all over, but it's got to be even, have a go at that. Because once you've mastered that, then you can start to produce stuff like this, and you can have some real good fun. This is another penning. This is just a simple outline of a penning, which links nicely to the pencil drawing. And this shows a little bit clearer about the stages of what happens on the computer. So the base colour is then done. So I'll just move this thing out of the way. It looks like it's got an extra eye. And then I put the shadowing and the highlights on. The good thing about that, again, is the base colour, if I go back to it, is I can change that. And because I've done the shadowing and the detailing on other layers, I can often not have to go back and change them as well. Sometimes you do, because those extra layers on top don't change the colour properly. But it just means that I can produce loads of variations. I also do watercolour as well. My earlier work was watercolour, again going back to the time when I used to do loads of different versions. But this is a watercolour just for a bit of fun. And this is a watercolour for a plate on Antarctic whales for a book. And this is partly gouache, but mainly watercolour. And I did slightly cheat, if you call it. I airbrushed the background, because trying to get watercolour as smooth as that is quite difficult. But you can see the detailing, and the highlights were done in gouache. So again, I do work big, but this would take quite a long time for me to actually paint it in front of everybody. So it would have been a very long talk. I do also do oil paints occasionally. This was done 17 years ago, something like that. This was done to raise funds for the Shark Trust. And lo and behold, what's just happened recently is that I promised to do another oil painting to raise funds for the Shark Trust. This was my favourite shark again, the big eye sand tiger. So when I do the oil painting, I start with the drawing first and sketch that all up. Then that's put onto the canvas, just roughly put onto the canvas. People work different ways. I prefer putting all the background in first. Then I start to work up the shark. This was quite difficult, because there is no light where they go hunting, and these are squid they're hunting, and there is no light. So it's very difficult in your mind to work out exactly where the light is coming from. So I just had it round about the point of where the tip of the snout was. So again, these are all worked up on the squid, and that's the near final version. And then there's that one that was at the start of For the Love of Sharks. So this one now is me trying to get things. The question is now is that, to a certain extent, because photography is so amazing, is that what is the purpose of illustrations? I mean, I'm often asked that. Now there's all photographers, they're going everywhere, there's loads of photographs, and digital photography has just taken off. I mean, the information that I get now, ever since digital photography has been around, especially with sharks and rays, is phenomenal. When I first started, when I did Sharks of the World, I was just really using just descriptions, specimens which had been completely curled up and were brown and whatever, and basically maybe some grainy photos. But now, just nearly every species, there's a reasonable photo. What an illustration or an illustrator can actually do is it can do comparisons quite simply. These are the soles to show the differences between the sole species which are found in British waters. You could try and montage photos together, but you won't get the features because it's not so much the colour. These things change colour all the time. And so if you had it in colour, you'd be misled because we always go by colour. Because if you ask somebody if they've seen an animal, the first thing they'll describe it as, the first thing comes in their mind is the colour. That's what they say is the colour. And that often, especially with the fishes, which can change on a 6 months, their colour is not the best thing. You're looking for the body shape. And that is when you have a simple pencil drawing, you can start to show that very clearly and what the differences are. And again, with the blennies, and have them to size, trying to montage that all together. And I think it also resonates when you get illustrations, that it tends to resonate more with the person that's looking at it than it would do if it was just a photo. We find for ourselves, we also we do publishing, and we tend to find that with illustrations, illustrated books tend to still do better than these big, huge photographic books. They're starting to die off because photographs are everywhere, but with an illustration, you've got somebody who's interpreted that specimen, in this case, a blenny, and you have a bit of passion coming across. You can see that in all the illustrations that you ever see. You can also explain quite simply, how an animal's behaviour. You couldn't take that shot because you got, above water and below water. It's also, there are photographs like this, but it tends to be blurry and they are not all when you draw something like that, you can put everything in focus. You have a depth of field going all the way back because you're drawing it accurately all the way through. So you can show details a lot clearer on an illustration than you can photographically. You can also produce artwork that is engaging. And also produce scenes that are impossible to actually photograph. This was done to have as a colouring in sheet for our Marine World book, but it was just to engage the public, to let them have a bit of fun. So as you can see, I started colouring this one in, but it's a nice complex colouring sheet because I've often found with the colouring sheets that you get, especially when it's meant for the children, they're not as complex as the children love to really colouring in stuff. So that's another reason it's also more engaging than looking at a photograph. You can also produce, like in the museum here, I've seen quite a few of your other prehistoric scenes. You can only do that with an illustrator. This thing was taken from in Bedfordshire, where they have these beds where they found all these ammonites and other shells and some teeth, and it was just reconstructed from those actual species. It was also nice to work with the researcher because basically the water is purposely green because he reckoned at that time that the water, because of the combination of the chemicals that were in there, actually you had a green sea, not a blue sea. So you can show scenes that can never be seen ever. It's also nice, again, going back to the pictorial thing. You could try and have loads of photographs all lined up, but it will tend to be dead specimens, or if not, they'll have different colour hues or whatever. You can allow for that when you're illustrating something. You can do it as if it's perfect lighting with no blue casts, that you can compare the sizes together. You can also put behaviours all of one species. This is one I did the polar bear, but I've done things like foxes and whatever, where they're all behaving in their different manners, all in one nice big picture, and it's engaging again. The biggest thing that science has to do with the public is to engage them, because once they're engaged, they'll give you more information. Especially when you've got to protect so many species these days, you've got to have the backing of the general public to want to help you. It also helps things like comparing movements. This was just comparing the gait of these four species. And comparing species that are very, very similar, but trying to get across to the person looking at it what are the features that you're actually looking. Because often when you get them laid out on a slab, they do tend to try and look very similar. You've got to get all the detail in there and get across exactly how do you tell these species apart. This goes back to the thing about doing various colour works. I didn't have to redraw every single one. I didn't have to do all the shadowing and the highlights. I could produce the backgrounds and change the backgrounds individually. These are just 6. I think I've got 14 variations of the thornback ray. Matthias Stayman actually he said they should change the name of this skate. It should be the chameleon skate, because literally it comes in all colours you could possibly think of, and some are being looked at about where they occur. Often the weird thing that's just happened recently, again because the Mediterranean guide, is that I always thought, when everybody said, how do you tell? It's got to have thorns on its tail and it's got a stripy tail. Well, I was doing some work with people in Israel, and they said, well, the thornback ray we have hasn't got that stripy tail. It's really muted in colour. So the description of actually highlighting that it's got a stripy tail isn't always the way to actually tell it apart. And again, that's going back to getting the information right and getting the illustrations right, and sometimes seeing all this out there is very important. This is why sometimes having colour can be very confusing, because how do you describe what thornback ray is? You've got to go back to what the actual features are. You can also highlight, there are photographs like this, but you can put all the detailing that you want and actually bring the focal length right, and you can have a bit of play with colour. And also impossible scenes. So again, you can create things that can never happen. A visually interesting thing, to actually show all these animals all together. It's a cover for a book, of course, but it just makes an interesting piece of artwork. You can also have fun with it. Anthropomorphizing animals is not always bad. This was done for out in Belize to actually try to get the locals not to catch sharks and eat them, is to eat chickens. And this went down really well because you'd engage with the children, engage with everybody there because they looked at the picture, and then you could get across the message. So again, sometimes just playing with what an illustrator does. It's scientifically based. It looks like a bull shark, but you can have some fun with scientific illustration. You can also show in one view feeding behaviours. This was done for the Manta Trust, just to show the sequence that how a giant manta feeds. And also sequences, there are photos, this was taken, but they're all taken at different times, different angles, whatever. You can actually put that all together as if you're viewing it from one view. There's actually some more extra on top, but it's not wide enough. Here is the evolution of mobulids, all in one shot, just making a nice swirling thing just to get across the message. So again, it's playing with ideas as well. Scientific illustration is starting to sort of realize it can explain stories as well. Life cycles, nice simplistic way to actually describe a life cycle of a barnacle. A behaviour of a bee, where did you want to take the so the behaviour of a bee, so you can show how the waggle dance actually explains where the food source is. Evolutionary trees. This is a mammalian one that was done for a book for Liam Drew. It just makes a pretty picture. You're looking at it rather than having loads of lines going and trying to explain it. People will try and follow it all through. I don't only do animals and whatever. I've done mathematical books. and whatever. This is a Mobius strip. Has anyone done a Mobius strip before? If they haven't done a Mobius strip, take a photo and have a go at doing that. It's really, you won't believe what happens. You'll end up with interlinked loops, just coming from one loop like that. When you cut it out, you just can't believe how it's actually happened. But again, this is an illustration just explaining something very simple. As you said with the sketches, like you sent sketches, this is the sort of thing that I end up by actually having. This is for infographics. So I would say that all scientists need to be able to somehow draw in some sort of way. It doesn't have to be amazing, it just has to get across enough that the illustrator that's actually working on it can actually understand what it is. So this was two halves. But again, it's a good basis. It's a good way of thinking. In fact, interesting, I do a scientific illustration course at the MBA in Plymouth. And the last one Jack Schul and I did is that we had a load of scientists, and we took them down to the National Marine Aquarium there, and we asked them to sketch all these fish, to draw it. And the thing they were coming back was really interesting. They've seen these fish before all the time, but because they're drawing the fish, they're starting to see things they hadn't seen before, because they're trying to understand, because when it goes to the brain, it goes through your eye, the brain's got to interpret it to draw it, and you're taking in far more information than you thought you could. So drawing is a really good skill to have, not because it has to be perfect, but you'll find there's a lot more information and a lot more understanding when you draw something than if you just looked at it or even took a photo. So that's what I end up with the sketch, like you were showing me. It takes quite a bit of toing and froing to get it exactly right. But again, the infographics are just a really interesting use. There's a lot more being used now. So you can show life cycles. But it's all in one big picture, and the idea is to make it eye-catching, because this text is quite small. But the way I've always learnt it when I was doing graphics is that you've got to catch the person's attention. So somebody walking along or anything else like that you have to grab their attention first to go and get a bit closer to what that is. Once you've gotten to that point, you've got to have something just to bring them in a bit more closer, and then you can then have the text or whatever message you want to carry. It's a phased bringing something in. Because if that wasn't visually interesting and it just had loads of text, people wouldn't even look at it. They just don't look at it. So when any of you wanted to get across any messages or any posters or anything else, that's the thing. You've got to have something eye-catching first, and then bring them in closer, and then get the final message through. This is a shark anatomy, but again, there's the great hammerhead. It makes people look at it, but then they look at all the other details, and then they'll take in all the other information about shark anatomy. Often, this was done with the angel tagging in the Canary Islands, because they were asked that they put these on boards. Were on the beaches that they were doing all this tagging, because they were asked so many times by people with all these research divers going into the water, especially at night time, exactly what they're doing. So they put these boards up to actually explain what they're actually doing and stop the questions as well. So there's also, you can explain again research methods, which are a lot more understanding. There's a lot of things. When I went to Sharks International, there's all the new researchers, all the undergraduates and postgrads. They all have these posters. But some understood the idea of actually having something eye-catching, and some were just like loads of text and loads of photos. You've got to have something interesting, eye-catching, that people can understand. And often an illustration does that rather than just a photo, because again, you have some better connection than you would do, because somebody else has interpreted, somebody else has tried to draw it for you. It's also, you can use it to explain fishing methods or any other methods like that, actually comparing it. It's nice and simple. You can add more details onto it. You can use it elsewhere. These are produced as vectored images. So basically, these can be 100 miles across and not lose any detail because they're all vectored. My work has also been used in field guides, but often in guides for NGOs. This was the one that came from the FAO, the IO to TC thing, with the pelagic fleets. So again, to get the people on board to actually write down the right species. There are other comparison pages as well. A similar thing done for the Gulf of Lasmo project, Arabian sharks. Again, working again in the Med. This is the one done for Mercy in Turkey. Again, British sharks. These ones are watercolours. These were done ages ago on stuff like that. But this particular illustration has been used for loads of aquaria in the UK because it blows up really nice and big, and it's eye-catching, and you've got big sharks and there's big open mouths and whatever, and it's just a good centerpiece. This was produced for. I just got to get this right. Okay, this was produced for the GSRI when they went to a couple of CITES events, I think about over 10 years ago. They were actually trying to show how, what the stages of sharks were protected. If you look at the timeline on there, to people understand, there's not a lot of these sharks actually being projected, and what the possible ones were that they would like to have on the list. So they were pretty optimistic that they could get those few in the orange on that side. But it was nice to actually display it to get people to understand how little and how long it's taken to get there. Well, I've got some pretty good news. I don't know what everybody knows about this. These species, and this is not all of them because there's a few, these were all the requiem sharks and all the hammerhead sharks. There's a few off here because of the glyphis sharks, which are on the list as well, but I couldn't fit them all in on this thing. I produced all these illustrations that were taken to the CITES meeting in Panama last month, the COP22. All these species are now CITES listed, every single one. So that previous one there about how little we actually have protected, that's what they came back with. All these species are protected. That's just the sharks. But the reason why they're able to protect them is the one thing with all these illustrations, getting these illustrations right, getting them correct, is that the one thing they proved, they look very similar. And if they look very similar and you've protected one or two, you've got to protect them all because you can't tell the difference easily. And that's what it led on. And again, that goes back to getting scientific illustration correct. If you get it correct and you do it right, it can be used for so much good. So the final message is for coming to that time of year. So happy Christmas. I don't mind questions if people want to do questions.
So first of all, let me thank you for this quite interesting and open, it was like a presentation that opens my mind towards scientific illustration. I was just looking, which species is this? But then, listening at your talk, I find out which are the potential and what really do scientific illustration nowadays. It's like a silent message you revealed us. So if anybody has some question for Marc, don't be shy.
Have you seen actually all the species that you have figured? Ha davvero visto tutte le specie di cui ha fatto un'illustrazione?
No, I haven't. Unfortunately, I'd love to, but then again, if I'd have seen them all, I wouldn't have been able to time to draw them all. I've got, I think, those pencil drawings I've got, because I thought somebody might actually ask the question. I've got about 2,500 pencil illustrations. That's not the colour paintings or anything else like that. So if I went and saw 2,500 species, that's probably a lifetime, isn't it? Something like that. So no, unfortunately, I'd love to. Those ones I have seen, yeah, it is so nice. I think the nicest things I've ever had is like when I did Sharks of the World, when I was doing species that really were from descriptions and guesswork, and then suddenly finding 10 years later there was a good photo and it was pretty accurate. That really pumped me up to find something like that, especially these deep sea species. But yeah, I'd love to go and see. Anyone who wants to take me around the world and I can see these species, I'd love to.
Yes, that was one of my questions. So what was the species you liked most to draw? But you already answered. So deep species, and yes. Some more questions?
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Amazing. And just I was thinking about where your passion for marine inhabitants comes from.
The passion from what comes out your passion for marine animals?
Marine animals was got it? That's okay. It was a slight accident because I've always loved natural history. You know, ever since I was a child, I used to draw animals all the time. And it just so happened, I live near the sea, but there wasn't a particular pickup to do that until I bumped into a publisher called Christopher Helm, who I was lucky or fortunate enough to work with, and my wife was as well, with natural history books. And he had a book written that had to have illustrations to it, and it was a marine book called Sea Life. And I ended up by writing a chapter of it on marine invertebrates. And I hadn't stopped not being involved with marine animals since then. Because from then on, with the author at the time that I worked on, we were thinking of doing a whales and dolphins book, and went to HarperCollins in London and offered it to Miles Archibald and said, you know, would you like this book? He said, no, there's too many of them out there. If you did a book on sharks, I'll take it. And that's how I got involved with sharks. And I think the thing to learn from that is you've got to take your opportunities when they occur. You know, you have a passion, but windows will open, and they'll open in some funny ways that you've never really predicted. I haven't predicted, but I just took the opportunity. And it is a passion. I mean, illustration is a passion. And one thing I'd like to everybody do is to start drawing again. You know, a lot of people, when they were small, they always drew, all the time, scribbled, carry on. It's such a good mental health thing as well, just to draw and doodle and explain things and whatever. So I would, if you're going to take away anything from this, is just find a sketch pad or a piece of paper and a pencil and just start drawing. Because it doesn't matter how good you are, you will always get better. You know, and you shouldn't be judged on that thing. You shouldn't judge yourself too much. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't like any of my artwork. So, you know, don't feel bad you don't like yours, because you're always self-critical, and you should be self-critical. And so, but enjoy doing it and see yourself improve. So, you know, if you've got a passion, start drawing things. And if you're doing it here, they've got so many specimens, it's just like, it's a whale of a time.
Some more questions? Of course.
So I was wondering, like how computer graphics changed making illustrations, And second question: how much time you take on average to draw an illustration? For example, the polar bears you showed before. How much it took?
Computer graphics has changed. I try not to it to change me, because you can go right way down the road. You can produce these things like skins, and you can produce 3D modeling, and they just look amazing. And it's so much improving all the time. You know, initially when they first came out, you could actually see that they were not real. It was done by computer. Now it's getting to a point that it's getting so close to reality, it's difficult to tell the other scale of whether it's actually real or not. I try to steer away from getting the computer taking too much over. The advantage I've got with computers with me is always publishing, of course, is that when you have a piece of artwork done, it used to go away to scanners. And depending on how good the scanner was, depending on what the quality of the artwork ended up when it was printed. The good thing about doing it on computer is you miss that stage out. You also, as an illustrator, also miss the stage that is when your artwork gets lost. I have had so much artwork lost at the printers. It wasn't the printers, it was the scanners. They just disappears. But it stops that actually happening. And it just means it gives me more variation. I think also it also makes you a bit bolder than you would do. So again, if anybody wants to start drawing or whatever, and they've got a little tablet and play around with that, it's great because you have this Control Z. So if you make a mistake, you can just do Control Z, and that's like, I'll have another go. But I think that's the thing, is you've got to see it as a tool, not as taking over, because you can, as I said, have all these different types of brushes you can create, and then it starts to take over from you putting your talent into that artwork. As for time, it takes forever. It's my biggest problem is to say stop, because I have like everybody, we all have to make money. You know, it would be a lovely world if we didn't have to make money and we can get on with what we wanted to do. And then you would see the most amazing illustrations, not from me, but from everybody. Because everybody has to tailor the amount of work you can do on a piece of artwork to how much money is available. You always give more than what you're getting paid because you have a passion for it. But it just comes to a point that you have to tailor it. So the longest piece of artwork ever taken, I don't know. I mean, it's the painting takes the time because there aren't any quicker ways to do stuff. But just trying to think the longest piece of artwork I've done. I mean, over a period of time, as a conglomerate piece of artwork, I'm working on a massive project right now, which is going to take another 7 or 8 years. And I think it's the more detail. Angel sharks. I've just done a thing on angel sharks. They are a nightmare because their patination is just so detailed. And whereas you can just dot the pattern and it looks roundabout okay, you know, being someone meticulous, you start to try and look for the pattern that's there. So you spend your time trying to work it out, and they could take a couple of days, something like that, just to get the pattern right. So yeah, they do take between a day and no more than a fortnight if I can help it. But there will be one that will take longer than that.
There's another question there, I think.
I have 2 questions actually. So probably I missed this at the beginning, but when did you decide to become a scientific illustrator, and what was the hardest part of your work at the beginning?
Thank you. I think a decision. I don't think there was a particular moment that I could actually say I was going to be illustrator. There are people who actually plan ahead, and I've talked to loads of people who've actually thought ahead, and I absolutely admire them that they had the guts to do that. I mean, my first real sort of illustrations, as it were, weren't anything to do with natural history. They were pen and ink illustrations of pubs, inns, restaurants, because that is when there was loads of money, because they wanted a drawing of their pub, and then you did their menu, and you had all sorts of stuff to do with the pub, whatever the pub was, you sort of put that in. So I suppose that was the first thing of actually saying I'm going to be an illustrator, and I carried on doing that. But there was all other bits of things happening at the same time. But to become a scientific illustrator was probably at that point when I was offered the job to be an illustrator for Sea Life, when I said to Christoph Helm, I'll do it. And I think that was the biggest leap that I ever made. And starting out, I think that's starting out, it was easier and harder at the same time to actually get yourself known. It's getting your name out there. I was very fortunate to have that book, Sea Life, which was used a lot, seen a lot, and then following on the heels of that to do Sharks of the World. That was the thing that sort of brought my name up, and that was very fortunate. So a hardship of actually trying to get my name out there, I sort of was lucky enough to have the right books at the right time to put my name forward. But nowadays it's a different thing, because you've got Facebook and Instagram and everything else like that. That sounds great, put your name up there. But then you're competing with the whole world. Literally the whole world, you're trying to get your name better. And when some of the work that's out there is absolutely amazing. And you're trying to understand why they haven't got a job or more work, because there probably isn't that much work out there at that time to accommodate everybody that has the skill level to produce such wonderful artwork, which is disappointing for me, because I see the work these people can actually do, and it's stunning, and someone should pick them up and do it. But I think it's the way that natural history is not always perceived as the thing to always do and always have. If it was cakes, it would be a different thing. Everybody, loads of cake stuff is dead easy. Draw loads of cakes and everybody would have it. I think things like the marine world and even natural history itself is a smaller market to actually have your artwork out there. Does it help?
Okay. I think some more question? No. So I think it has been really inspiring, at least in this room, listening to you and seeing the potential really of what you did, but of the scientific illustration itself. And personally, I have been thinking about it so deeply, and it's quite inspiring. Yes, I want to thank you a lot for having here. And there was a thing I want to tell you. When you show us the cave paintings from the past, I was thinking about a cave painting in Levanzo, in a cave called the Genovese cave. I don't know if you know about it, but there are tunas depicted quite perfectly. So we were looking at terrestrial animals, and I was thinking, I have to tell him that in Levanzo in Sicily, there is these cave paintings really well done on tuna fish. I will pass you the name later for next presentations. Okay, so thank you really, really very much. And I think Professor Boer wants to show you the potential of a scientific illustration in our museum.
We have to leave something on our book.
We have
Book. Yes. Because as you were describing, children like a lot to make drawings, so we have lots of drawings. pictures of sharks and whatever, and so we want also one of yours.
Okay. So thank you to everybody, and see you next time.
And if you want to buy the book, it's for sale.
Questo lo possiamo dire anche in italiano.
È vero, se volete comprare il libro, che sono i primi che arrivano in un punto vendita.
Esatto, non si può comprare da nessun'altra parte.
Perché è l'anteprima nazionale di questo.
Esatto. Grazie a tutti, alla prossima.